Browse around any bookshop on the planet and you will find Stephen King. He'll be lurking in the horror section because he is the king of horror. I have no issue with that. He may straddle the genres of the supernatural, fantasy, crime, drama and thriller, but pretty much everything he writes casts a dark, uncomfortable shadow. However, I think his contribution to science fiction gets overlooked. Maybe it's because he's already in the pantheon of horror authors, or his particular brand of storytelling doesn't deliver a rock-hard space opera or an extrapolation of physics. You know, classic SF. I would argue that Stephen King is actually one of the great modern science fiction writers. SF themes have been present in his writing since the very beginning of his career. And it may be the case that all of it, his entire oeuvre, is underpinned by science fiction. The first novel that King wrote, The Long Walk, more than hints at the horror, the pain and anxiety, the disposition to spill blood that we all grew to love over the past half a century. But ostensibly, it's a dystopian novel set in the future. It's a perfect example of how he builds a science fiction world and concept, then steers away from exploring that aspect, choosing instead to focus on character and plot. The Long Walk is about a seriously messed up battle royale, a televised, government-approved contest where teenaged boys just walk until they give up or collapse. And then they get shot in the head. Other books do a similar thing, but they often feel the need to explain why the world is like this. They talk about the dystopia itself. Stephen King tells a story within the dystopia. And that's the key distinction between traditional science fiction and Stephen King's own brand. The perspective, the field of vision. There may be an interdimensional war going on above our heads, but there's also normal people down on the ground who have a story to tell. Stanley Kubrick possessed the desire to create a masterpiece in every genre of filmmaking. Psychological drama, war film, horror, science fiction, comedy, satire, historical drama, love story, etc. I don't think Stephen King overtly chased a similar dream, but he does have the knack of delivering a book in most of the big celebrated subgenres of science fiction. In his own style, of course. The Stand is his post-apocalyptic opus. In many ways, it follows the blueprint of a typical end-of-the-world story. A deadly virus wipes out most of civilization, and this is the story of what happens next. I bloody love the end of the world. But this is the King! He can't just leave it at that and write about rebuilding society and growing vegetables. He makes it about something else, but again commits to character. The idea was to write a contemporary Lord of the Rings, but with an American setting. A good versus evil epic injected with a supernatural twist. Hopping around genre, but with science fiction at its heart. First Contact. What could be more sci-fi than the revelation that we're not alone in the universe? Stephen King has written about this subject a few times, always from a different angle, and never completely committing to the close encounter. The Tommyknockers, not a favourite among King fans, but I really like what he's doing here. It takes a big chunk of the book to figure out what we're really dealing with, and by then the characters are distracted or brainwashed. Essentially, an alien spacecraft that probably crashed thousands of years ago is discovered in the woods. The locals are compelled to uncover it, and they start to transform, becoming symbiotically linked to the ship. Once again, that is the plot to hundreds of Golden Age and classic science fiction books. But King uses it as a mechanism to talk about other things. Our main character is an alcoholic. It's well documented that Stephen King also had a drinking problem, and he quite often used his characters to explore that issue. Sometimes allegorically, sometimes right on the nose. I see Under the Dome as a spiritual successor to The Stand and the Tommyknockers, whereby we're dealing with something inexplicable, something alien, but King uses the situation to create human drama. I'm sure some science fiction fans will turn their noses up at these books because of the lack of real science. They want to know how the dome actually works, who put it there, and why. But it's a fascinating examination of small-town politics, power, opportunistic leverage, and the horror of tribalism. It's his Lord of the Flies, but it's under an alien-induced dome. And 11/22/63 is King's great time travel novel, probably his purest attempt at science fiction. I guess all time travel books require a fantastical leap of faith to make them work. So this subgenre really suits the King aesthetic. Typical King, the story leans into far more interesting territories. It's about nostalgia, love, and the responsibility of wielding the power of knowledge of the future. Science fiction! If that was the end of the story, a story about a man who sold nearly 500 million books, most of them horror, some of them science fiction, I would happily endorse the King of Horror label that's hanging around his neck. But it's not that fucking simple, is it? Obviously, this isn't news to Stephen King fans, but the casual reader may not be aware that almost everything he wrote is interconnected in one giant multiverse. It's all centered around the Dark Tower series, which eventually tells the story of a godlike entity that created reality, multiple universes that overlap and intertwine, or something awesome like that, I'm told. I haven't actually read them all. Of course, the mere existence of a multiverse isn't enough to uplift King's horror and supernatural stories into science fiction. Genre is more of an aesthetic than a technicality. But it is an elegant answer or explanation to a lot of hand-wavy mythos and legends. And that's something you rarely see in genre fiction. Pennywise the Clown, the Shining ability, carries telekinesis, a sentient, murderous Plymouth Fury, all can be traced back to a dark force that exists in another dimension, or the product of aliens in another reality punching a hole into one of Stephen King's worlds. So he's telling stories in this multi-layered manner, usually horror in the middle, that's how the stories manifest, a character-based, coming-of-age, introspective drama on the top, and at the root of everything is science fiction, tethered to the multiverse. That means he can adjust the knobs on mood and perspective and give the reader whatever his imagination conjures up. Spaceships, monsters, vampires, and magic, and it all fits together. And brilliantly, you don't need to read 17 books to understand what's happening. You just read King. Upon reflection, I still think he deserves more plaudits from the science fiction community, but he can't be pigeonholed. Just like Kubrick, one genre simply isn't enough.